Do you know what the British Army's longest ever continuous deployment was? Well, it was called Op Banner and it ran from August 1969 to July 2007. More than 300,000 soldiers served as part of the deployment and nearly 1,500 were killed or died while on operations. My British viewers will have grown up against the backdrop of the conflict, but viewers from other parts of the world may be surprised to learn that all of this took place on British soil, in Northern Ireland. Now, I'm not an expert on the conflict in Northern Ireland, but I do know there's been sectarian violence in the country for centuries. In the late 1960s, that manifested itself in very serious riots, especially in Londonderry and Belfast.
The rioting was huge, and the local police force, which is the Royal Ulster Constabulary, was a small local police force and just wasn't equipped or didn't have the manpower to deal with what were mass riots. And it was, petrol bombs and gunshots and so on. And after all, the police simply couldn't deal with the level of trouble as it was. And so they called on the army to come in. So they came onto the streets. And at first, the Catholic population in particular was extremely glad to see the army because it meant that they were safe. The army's there and it's going to stop the Protestant mobs from burning us out, which at first is what happened, but unfortunately it turned sour pretty quickly.
That is well-known historian Jonathan Trigg. Not only does he write books on various aspects of military history, but he was also an infantry officer who served as part of Op Banner. John has recently published a book on the IRA in East Tyrone, and in today's interview he's going to explain how the British Army became embroiled in such a dangerous and complicated counter-insurgency campaign. He'll also tell us about some of the key events and of course how the army performed and how its experience affected future operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a fascinating story, so let's crack on.
The issue always with when you're trying to bring an army into any civil disturbance and riot situation is it's a hammer to crack a nut, and the British Army is a pretty big hammer, and they the soldiers at the time and the officers involved simply weren't trained, equipped, or ready to deal with what was a riot, civil disturbance situation, not an armed revolt or insurrection. The army at the time had armored cars, grenades. You don't use grenades in the Falls Road of West Belfast, and they didn't understand the situation because obviously that divide between Catholics and Protestants. There's still Catholics and Protestants in England and Wales and Scotland and so on, but the times when we used to burn each other out and go around with pitchforks and what have you is hundreds of years ago. So they simply didn't understand the problem, and they saw it very much as there's rioting in the streets. We need to deal with it. Some people have got a few guns, and we need to deal with that. And they went in very, very hard. And in July 1970, there was a particular operation in West Belfast on a place called the Falls Road, which is a Catholic-dominated part of the city, where the British Army cordoned it off, the entire area. And this is we're talking thousands of people in back-to-back terraces, and didn't let people in or out for several days. And they used tear gas and so on, and they searched every house for weapons. And it really turned the population against the army, and that was one of the big turning points. And then that started to happen across the rest of Northern Ireland. The classic terrorist operation is you are there to get the authorities to overreact. As soon as they overreact, you start to get more support on your side, and then you hit them again, and then they overreact again, and it becomes a vicious circle whereby they just you just keep on ramping up the pressure until hopefully the government's putting tanks on the street. That if you're a terrorist, that works. And that's what they did, and they became very proficient at it, ramping up the pressure on us. We would overreact, and therefore create more of a chasm between us and the Catholic population in particular.
And was part of the problem the fact that during the sort of post-World War II era, Britain had been involved in sort of some campaigns like this, like Malaya, like Kenya against the Mau Mau. But since then, they'd been focusing on big war on the plains of Central Europe. Were there just problems with the sort of training and the just the thought process behind dealing with civilians.
Very, very good point. You're absolutely right. The mass of the army, even in the drawdown after the Second World War away from the Empire, the mass of the army very much switched to a NATO, North German plane role of tanks, of long-range artillery, of air power, and so on. And that's what the army was trained and equipped to deal with. The Warsaw Pact forces sweeping out of East Germany into West Germany, and that's what we were looking to do. The post-imperial drawdown in the main was done by local forces, and police forces with relatively little regular army intervention. They used specialist forces. Hence, the modern SAS came out of the Malayan Scouts, which we're dealing with, and that was so. It was relatively small numbers of the British Army had been involved in those kind of counterinsurgency type campaigns, and they'd also those things happened a long way away from Britain. They like you said, they were in Kenya, they were in Malaya, and so on. It was in Indonesia and so on. It was far, far away. It wasn't literally in a part of Britain. I mean, there's an apocryphal tale. Now, whether it's actually true or not, I've not been able to find out. So I can't pin it down. But when they started, when the troops arrived in Londonderry, and they were trying to get the crowds to disperse from rioting, they unfolded that you have to, it's called reading the riot act. That's where the term comes from. So an officer with a megaphone will read out that this is an unlawful demonstration and they must now disperse. And the soldiers unrolled a banner with the instructions written on in big letters so that people could read it if they couldn't hear. The only problem was the instructions were in Arabic. Because the banner had last been used in Aden, so not many of the locals or the soldiers, for that matter, could actually read it. And that was the army was used, it was equipped and trained and used to dealing with, if it was dealing with counterinsurgency, things far, far away. But the mass of soldiers, it was North German plain. And that's what they were used to, and so streets of Belfast and what have you was a world away.
So there was this sort of mismanagement then, it sounds like, by the authorities, by the army brass. How did that then affect the growth of the IRA? How quickly did they develop, and how were they organised?
It's really the British Army kind of high command does have. I mean, at the same time, I can understand how difficult it was for them to adjust, but I don't think that they did a brilliant job, particularly in the first kind of couple of years. And I think that the task was kind of too much for them. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, when they made a blunder, it just fueled IRA support. And really, in those first kind of few years, from 69 to 72, 73. I mean, Northern Ireland, particularly the cities, particularly Londonderry and Belfast. I mean, it was like the Wild West. Soldiers would go out and patrol, and they'd be running gun battles up and down the streets. Snipers absolutely. I mean, I interviewed lots of soldiers, and they said it was. You would have a contact. You'd be hit by an ambush or a shoot and whatever on almost every single patrol that you went out on. And the people running up and down the streets with guns, taking pot shots at you, and you're shooting at them and trying obviously not to hit the local civilians and so on. And there was a big groundswell of support for the IRA. Lots of youngsters kind of flooded in to their ranks. And the way they structured, I mean, this is one of the strange things I've always thought about paramilitary. Call them freedom fighters, terrorists, paramilitaries, whatever you want to, but they always tend to organize themselves in much the same way, or they attempt to, of the enemy that they're facing. So they call themselves, and the IRA, they call themselves military titles. So they'd say, oh, we're the second, West Belfast company, the Ballymurphy company of the second West Belfast battalion. So they organise themselves in companies, battalions, and then brigades, all under. But those names have no reflection in what people would know as military reality. So a platoon in a normal infantry regiment and so on would have 30 men, company 100, and a battalion 600. In an IRA company, there'd be 20. In a battalion, maybe 50. and so on. So they don't correspond in terms of size, but that's how they'd organise themselves. They'd all be local, so you would literally join your local unit that deals with your patch of streets, and it's your home turf, and you know everyone, and everybody knows you, and that's the way they were organised up until the early 70s, when that structure, about 73, 74, started to fall apart because the police in particular got so many informers throughout the organisation and because these guys all knew each other, you joined the IRA on your street and so on, and you knew everyone else who was in the IRA in that street. So if you got him, you got Patrick to become an informer, Patrick could tell you about everybody else on that street, and that was a real problem for them. So they switched over, and it was Jerry Adams who led the switch. He wrote the paper that really informed the IRA about it, and he switched to what he called active service units, which were what we would see now as classic cell structure for modern terrorism. So we're talking 4 to 8 people at most in one unit, and only the commander would know really anyone outside of that unit. All the others would just know each other. So if one was, one turned to the police and became an informer and what have you, they wouldn't be able to give them information on a whole host of other people. It would just be on a small number of people, and that way it became far more efficient, and far more deadly.
And what sort of operations were these guys running, and how effective were they in general? I know that's a very broad question, but just, can you maybe give us 1 or 2 examples?
In the 70s, very much so, in the early 70s, like I said, it was a Wild West, and it tends to be much of the violence was concentrated in the cities, in Belfast and Londonderry, and it was shoots. So they would literally, right, we think there's some soldiers going to come out of this base at some point. They always do. They come on patrol. So let's go and grab some guns from a cache that we've got, and they'll have maybe an Armalite and a couple of M1 Garands and what have you, and then they'd wait for them at the end of the street. Soldiers would come along and they open fire, and you have a running gun battle, with them. They also carried out bombing campaigns. Worst was in Belfast, called Bloody Friday, where the IRA, over a dozen bombs were set off within a kind of a 10-hour period in the city in commercial premises. More than 10 people were killed, dozens were injured, and there were no warning bombs placed in bus depots or department stores and what have you. The countryside, which is most Northern Ireland, it's a very rural place, was relatively quiet. But then, particularly as the 80s kind of came around, they started to be far more effective in the countryside. And it's all about terrain in war, as I'm sure your listeners know from their historical knowledge. What you can do in the city is restricted because of collateral damage, as we know it now. If you carry out shoots and bombings there, the chances are that innocent local civilians are going to get killed or injured. Out in the countryside, there's far less of that. So for instance, in East Tyrone themselves, so in 1988. In July, there was an incident called the Ballygawley bus bombing, where soldiers from 1st Battalion Light Infantry, they'd been home on leave, they'd flown back into Belfast Airport, transferred onto an army coach, and were going to their barracks in Omagh, which is Tyrone's county town. And it's late at night on a Saturday, and they passed a telegraph pole on the main A5 road, which is single, it's not dual carriageway or whatever, and boom, there was a lorry trailer parked by the side of the road, 200 pounds of high explosive in it, and that was done by command wire. So the IRA volunteers on that operation were on a hill above the road. They had a command wire which went all the way under the road through a drainage culvert to the bomb itself, and as soon as the bus reached the bomb, bang, press the button, up it goes. Bus was blown about 40 feet off the road into the field. A dozen, 8 light infantrymen were killed, and everyone else was very badly wounded. at the time, and that it was that sort of attack that they did. They would also carry out close quarter assassinations on, because there was a lot of locally raised army units. So the big one was the Ulster Defence Regiment, which was one of the British Army's strangest ever units, because it was a militia type unit. So they had small numbers of full-time members of the UDR, but the majority of members were, milkmen, bus drivers, coal deliverymen,
In
teachers.
fact, don't you open the book, I think, with the story of a postman being shot on his rounds? Is that right?
Sammy Brush, yeah, postman, one of many, and so that's what he would do for his normal job. And then once he'd finished his job, he'd go home, put on his UDR uniform, and go out and patrol that night around his local village, around his local town. And of course, those people, because of their local knowledge, were seen, understandably so, by the IRA as prime targets. So they were, as far as the IRA is concerned, they were never off duty. So if one was, so Sammy, yeah, perfect example. He's there delivering a letter. It was what's called a come on operation. So that letter was actually posted by the IRA to that location in order to lure him to it. It's an isolated house, far from anywhere else, etc. So they basically lay in wait for him.
As the situation developed, the British were forced to deploy some of their special forces units. Of course, there was the famous SAS, the SBS, but also a unit known as the DET, or 14 Intelligence Company. Let's find out more.
The first really on the scene, was the SAS, early 70s, and that was done. Harold Wilson was the British Prime Minister at the time, and that was done really for PR. And there'd been a whole series of very large IRA attacks at the time, and Wilson was under real pressure to do something. So he announced that the SAS were going to be sent to Northern Ireland, which was a great surprise for the SAS, because no one had told them beforehand. So they were literally sitting there watching the news to be told, by the way, you're going to Northern Ireland. And they really didn't get involved in a major way until the kind of the late 70s, early 80s, where they would act really as the kind of the lethal end of the British response to the IRA. And so typically they would be tasked to carry out an ambush on a suspected weapons cache where the IRA put explosives or guns and so on, and where there was intelligence that would say, people are going to, so IRA volunteers at some point over the next 2-3 days are going to arrive, get those guns to carry out an operation. And in which case the SAS will be tasked to hopefully arrest those volunteers. If not, and the operation went hot, they would then act accordingly and would usually shoot them dead. But that was very much the kind of the lethal end of special forces operations in Ireland, and was relatively few and far between. That did not happen regularly. The bigger thing was the DET, as you rightly described, went under several names as it kind of transitioned. 14 Intelligence Company is what most people knew it as, and just as with the SAS, you had to be in the regular forces to volunteer, and you volunteered for a selection course, mainly run in the beautiful rolling hills of Wales, where it doesn't rain at all, and it's not cold and freezing and bloody awful most of the time. And you went through a very, very long selection and training process. And what you were there for was surveillance. So you weren't there primarily to, take on and shoot IRA volunteers. You were there to provide the long-term intelligence and surveillance on suspects that would enable either the police to arrest those individuals, in the act, find enough evidence on them to arrest them and convict them and send them to jail, or if necessary for the SAS to become involved and then to ambush the terrorists and, if necessary, shoot them dead. And the RUC also, they had their own kind of special units, one called E4A, catchy title, I've always thought, but that was their kind of armed response unit, because unlike everywhere else in Great Britain, the Northern Ireland was the only place where normal police officers carried guns. So if you were an IEC constable, then you carried a pistol at all times, which of course, as you know, does not happen anywhere else. In Great Britain, and most of the time you'd also be, you'd be walking around with an assault rifle, which but they wouldn't be involved. Those normal constables would not be involved in the type of operations that E4A would be. And we'd use a whole variety of others, particularly in the 70s, lots of kind of ad hoc units. So there was the MRF, and so on, which were kind of local initiatives, really. So units being set up by local commanders to try and mainly, it's most of the time it's around intelligence gathering. If you want to tackle the IRA in your local area, you've got to have intelligence on them, because the vast majority of people aren't involved. They're going about their normal daily routine, and they're not terrorists themselves. They don't get involved. Relatively small number. You need to know who they are, where they are, and what they're doing. The RUC and the army, after a while, when they twigged that intelligence was the key to success, knew that they either had to insert agents into the paramilitary organizations, and that was the Protestant paramilitaries as well, because in response to, well, in parallel with the birth and the growth of the IRA, the Protestants had their own paramilitary organizations, the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Ulster Freedom Fighters, and so on. And to beat them, you had to know who they were. So they would either, the police and the army would either insert agents, and they were very difficult to insert, because in most of these areas, as we touched on before, everyone would know each other. So having suddenly someone arrive out of the area that they didn't know, they weren't related to, hadn't been to the same school, and they go, oh, hello, even if they managed to get an accent, I'd like to join the IRA or the Ulster Volunteer Force. They go, really, do you want to do that? Okay, who are you again? And it was tremendously difficult. I mean, it's things like accent checks. So you're from Leicester, Chris, and so on. Now, and you've lived in South Africa for quite a long time now, but you would know the difference between a Cockney accent, a Brummie accent, a Welsh accent, Cornish. You'd know all of that, and of course, Northern Ireland is no different. So if you're born in Belfast, you would know that's a Londonderry accent, that's different, or that's the South Armagh one, or hang on a sec, they're from over the border in County Donegal. So they knew. So trying to, and we just, it's very, very difficult to emulate that. But so the main weight of intelligence was actually carried out by informers within the paramilitary organizations themselves. And I interviewed quite a few special branch officers who ran the informers within the paramilitary organizations, and over time they got better and better at it. So what they would do is they'd identify someone fairly young, so who'd become a member of the IRA or the Ulster Volunteer Force, 18, 19, and they'd kind of follow their career and wait till they were 21, 22. So they had a few years, they were experienced, they were accepted into the organization, and so on. And then they'd say, right, that guy, he is going to go far. I've looked at him, he knows what he's doing, and so on. So I'm going to go and turn him. And then they would follow a program of just incredible intensity on that individual. And they said that's we would make sure they knew that we knew who they were, and that they were never going to get a moment's peace. They wouldn't be hauled in and beaten up or anything like that. Nothing, nothing of that nature. But they would just be in the face of that paramilitary all day, every night. Just when they put their bins out in the morning, they'd be there. When they got to work, they'd be going hello. When they finished work, they'd be going hello, until they realise they are never going to get away from it. And then they would just work on them. And they'd work, and then they try and convince them. They make an approach, try and convince them to work with them, and they'd say no, and then they try again, and they try again, and they tried 40, 50 times until this guy knew that he's never going to leave me alone, ever. And so what am I going to do? And they start to realise that their options are, at some point I'm going to get caught, and then I'm going to spend the majority of my adult life in prison. I'm going to be sent away for possession of explosives, possession of a weapon, and these are 20-year sentences, and you don't get time off for good behaviour. You serve 20 years, and that's that adult life kind of gone. Or you're going to get killed. You'll be picking up a weapons at a hide, and the SAS will be waiting, and bang, you're dead. So on a lot of premises, they would then say, right, okay, I'll start to give you a bit of information, and then they'd use all sorts of tactics. And one of the ones that I was told about that I was genuinely shocked to hear was that most of the paramilitaries don't have pension plans. Amazingly, who would think you join the IRA and get a pension? But they didn't have pension plans, so they would be they'd become an informer, and then they would be made a member of the Armed Forces pension scheme.
Wow.
And because of course the MOD pension scheme is absolutely massive, hundreds and hundreds of thousand members, so they would then be joined, and so they would know that, because of course you couldn't give them a lot of money on a day-to-day basis, because if you're a paramilitary volunteer in the Ulster Volunteer Force or the IRA, and all of a sudden you turn up with a brand new car and you're going on holiday to Florida for 2 weeks and you're flashing the cash everywhere, then everyone's going to go, where did you get that money? And you're going to end up dead very, very quickly. So they give them a few quid, keep them going, so they could have some nice things and so on, look after their families, but not much. But then you've got a pension, and then you get to age 55 and so on, and then you turn around to your fellow paramilitaries and go, done my, I'm tired, I've done my stint, I'm going to move down south to the Republic and retire with my wife Mary. And they go, oh, thanks Brendan, you've been absolutely great, keep in touch and all that type of thing, and off you head, and you disappear. You don't disappear to the Republic, you disappear to England and set up home and draw your military pension, and then you're looked after for the rest of your life.
In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed. This helped to bring an end to the worst of the violence. But looking back, how effective was the British Army? What did it learn, and how important was this for future operations going forward?
In the first few years, the British Army really struggled, and it was parts of it were used to dealing with counterinsurgency, but a long way away, where British law in effect didn't really operate. It operated under different local legal restrictions, which were, to put it mildly, a bit more lax than you could operate in British soil, because of course Northern Ireland was and is part of Britain, and that is the dominating factor in dealing with it. I mean, a bit of an aside, and I apologise, but I always remember my first tour there, East Tyrone, and I was, we patrolled out, and we were due to be brought back in by helicopter. There was no movement on the roads at the time when I was there, because the IRA would blow you up with landmines too much. So you went everywhere by helicopter or on foot. No helicopters to bring us back in after patrol, so we patrolled in by foot. And I'm going up Dungannon High Street, and I look in the window, and it's a Woolworths. And again, this probably won't mean anything to people, non-British people, and so on. But Woolworths was a store that sold toys and famously pick and mix sweets, and all that type of thing. You went in there, and I caught my image in the plate glass window out front, and I'm there. I'm in full combat. I've helmet. I've got body armor on. I've got my encoded radio. I'm carrying an assault rifle that's loaded, and so on. And I'm looking at people who are just speaking my language. They're British, and they're walking up and down the street and walking in and out of Woolworths, and it's surreal. And they pay no attention to you. They just see you as that's perfectly normal. If you can imagine doing that on any other street, anywhere, walking in help, people will be running for cover, screaming in fear, and rightly so. But at that time and place, it just seemed perfectly normal. And by that stage, by the kind of late 80s, early 90s, the British Army, in terms of its counterinsurgency skills, was excellent. It had, in terms of its equipment, its training, its experience levels, was very, very high. And to be honest, I think the disadvantage was what that gave. It gave, and I'll use the word, it gave the British Army a bit of arrogance about what it could achieve. So when the likes of Iraq and Afghanistan came along, the British Army had a sense of itself that we can, we're used to dealing with counterinsurgency. We know what we're doing. We're going to be absolutely great. And they were caught, flat-footed, because of course those were very, very different scenarios. And they weren't in complete control. I mean, obviously, those type of operations. One of the biggest learnings is unified command, and of course there wasn't any because the Americans are in control, and we were a small part of that, operating with lots and lots of other partners, pretty much independently. And we weren't quick enough in terms of dealing with our equipment needs. And so in the early days, there was lots of things in Iraq, for instance, about our troops were in unarmored Land Rovers.
Yeah, like snatches and so
yes,
forth.
Exactly, snatched Land Rovers with hardly any helicopters, and and of course they just got blown to bits.
And wearing berets and no body armor and stuff.
Exactly. So it did. We kind of we got ahead of ourselves, and we thought, British Army said, we're absolutely great, and actually they needed to be a bit more humble. I think, and again, it took time. Institutions take time to learn, unfortunately.
But as they always say, throughout history, every army, including the British Army, always prepares for the last war it fought, right? So they're always a generation behind.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right, and that was it. I mean, Iraq when it started was obviously first Gulf War, and then second and so on, was back to the plains of Germany almost. It's all about tanks, artillery, missiles, and so on. Nothing about hearts and minds and small scale counterinsurgency work. And of course, we'd forgotten that to an extent because we got used to fighting small scale insurgency wars again. And you are spot on. And in a lot of ways, you can say, if you are the British Army or any other army, how do you know what conflicts you're going to get involved in next, and how can you prepare for it? Because there's not the money and the resources and effort, whatever, to be able to prepare for absolutely every sort of conflict.
So guys, I know many of you are either former or serving soldiers. Please do feel free to comment, tell us about your own experiences, and also if there's any conflicts you really want me to talk about and cover on the channel here. Maybe even someone you think I should interview. Until then, be sure to like and subscribe. You can also join my mailing list over at redcoathistory.com, where you'll get a free copy of my book about the Battle of Isandlwana. All right guys, take care.